So welcome everyone to the 40th annual Harney County Migratory Bird Festival. We are so excited to be able to offer these programs virtually. This morning's presentation is some more history and archaeology of Harney County with Scott Thomas, retired BLM archaeologist. So the Migratory Bird Festival, it takes place every year because of the enthusiasm and support of our community planning group. And that is everyone from federal agencies and, local businesses, nonprofit organizations, and community individuals. So we're just really thrilled to be able to work throughout the year to make these programs possible. So, who am I? I am Janelle Wicks. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and as a member of the Harney County Migratory Bird Festival Planning Committee, I'm very excited to be your host. What you can expect out of this presentation is about 40 minutes of program, and then some time for question and answer. Please remain muted throughout the presentation. This is going to help with feedback and white noise. If someone gets unmuted, I will be going through and checking and force muting things. So if you accidentally get unmuted and you can't figure out how to mute yourself back up, it's okay. I'll get you back. In the meantime, please feel free to type your questions and comments in the chat box. We love to have a little bit of discussion going on there. And then I will moderate the question and answer at the end of the presentations. Okay. So Scott Thomas has earned his Bachelor's of Science in Zoology from OSU in 1975 and a Master's of Arts in Anthropology from Portland State in 1982. He worked for 24 years for the Burns BLM office and retired in 2018. His research interests are varied, and they include the Clovis age sites, buffalo hunting circa 1500 AD, edible plant harvest, the 17-year-old Rimrock Shelter, and prehistoric pottery, all here in Harney County, along with public archaeology. In his spare time, you might find Scott gardening, surf fishing, or fashioning a willow basket. Today, Scott is going to be presenting on ancient cultures in Harney County, the Clovis research from 2003 to 2021, and late prehistoric buffalo hunters of Southeastern Oregon. Please, again, remain muted for the duration of the program and add your questions and comments to the chat box. There is going to be a short question and answer at the end of the session. This program is being recorded, so if you have an aversion to having your video caught in the screen, please go ahead and take your video off. And without further ado, Scott Thomas.
Thank you very much, Janelle. I'm going to take a few seconds here to switch screens so I can show you my presentation. Okay, this next topic is a lot younger than Clovis. This is late prehistoric, and I'll say right now these sites that I'm going to talk about date from about 1500 AD, so they're really close to the historic period. Next slide, please. And I'm going to be doing some reading here too, and I apologize in advance. I'd rather be ad-libbing, but I want to keep my thoughts all squared away because we haven't got a whole lot of time. In 1980, when I was a temporary archaeologist on Burns District, my crew found a very unusual site. We named it Lost Dune. It was later renamed Lost Dune 1, while surveying a new crested wheat planting. It was unusual because it contained many artifacts or traits that we had not seen before. They were brownware pottery, which I had never ever seen before in the field, and nobody on my crew had either. Some of the pottery was decorated. Many of the projectile points were desert side notched and cottonwood triangular, and I'll show you those later. But they're small arrow points that are very late in prehistoric time. Many of the other stone tools were made out of chert instead of obsidian, which seemed really strange because we're in the middle of Obsidianville here. A larger than number expected knives, scrapers, drills, and graving tools were found there. And obsidian blades made from special cores, we'd never seen any of those, and they're very rare in this part of the world. Sandstone or braiding stones, and many pieces of white tooth enamel were scattered throughout the site, and we also saw small fragments of burned animal bone. This site showed a new and different archaeology that we had never seen and caused us to ask a lot of new questions. We will go through the toolkit and other items later in the presentation, but first the questions. How old is the site? Were the people using these camps Northern Paiute, or was there another group that had a different toolkit that we'd not seen before? Where do these people come from? What big game were they hunting? How come we find mostly hunting and butchering tools and no plant grinding tools at this site? Are there other sites in the area that compare to Lost Dune 1, and what is their distribution in Eastern Oregon? Next slide. Okay, this is a simplified map of where Lost Dune was found originally. And as you can see, it's in Southeast Oregon, about 30 miles south of Burns. Next slide. Research between 1995 to 2001 by Bill Lyons from Washington State University was focused on these questions and provided answers. Lost Dune was occupied between 1550 and 1650 AD. Radiocarbon dates on the charcoal, these were determined using radiocarbon dates on charcoal that were found in hearths and on the tooth enamel that I mentioned earlier. And I want to add a quick note in here. You can date tooth enamel because one of the compounds in teeth is calcium carbonate. And within that calcium carbonate, there is a carbon molecule. So when you do a tooth date, you have to have more of it than when you do a charcoal date, but the method is still the same. At any rate, the people who lived at the site were probably Shoshone speaking from northern Nevada and eastern southwestern Idaho, because the western and northern Shoshone made pottery and used the same arrow points. Also, most of the stone tools and pottery materials found at Lost Dune came from far to the east and southeast of the site. In fact, some of the chert is from a place called the Tosawee Chert Quarry that's way down in northern Nevada, almost due north of Elko, or see Elko? Yeah. So it's at least 150 miles away from the site. From the teeth and bone fragments found at the site, it was determined that the people at the site were hunting, butchering, and consuming buffalo. Buffalo were present near Malheur Lake and elsewhere in Harney County till about 1800, but died out in northern Nevada by about 1500 AD. The presence of mostly hunting and butchering tools at the site indicated that about all that occurred there was processing buffalo kills and boiling bone fragments to extract the fat they contained. In 2011, we got lucky, and one of my crews that was out surveying in the Alvord Desert found another site called Lost Dune 2 in 2011. And since that time, 15 other sites have been found either in the field or searching the literature and looking at site forms from neighboring BLM districts. They are found in Lake County to the west of Harney County in the middle, and Malheur County to the east, from as far north as Burns all the way to the Nevada border. And I would not hesitate to say that I'm sure there are many other sites like this, but they're found outside of where I was allowed to go looking. Since I was the district archaeologist in Burns, I really wasn't supposed to be spending time on neighboring BLM districts looking for sites. However, I did get permission from the Lakeview district to do a couple of sites down on their district, and I was able to confirm that they truly are matching this pattern. The toolkits found at these 17 sites are very similar and unlike any other late prehistoric sites in the region. They all represent a movement of Shoshone people from northern Nevada, southwest Idaho in the search of bison once the bison herds thinned out in their area. And I will say that if you look at the notes taken by people that interviewed Indian people back in the early 1900s and maybe even late 1800s, the Burns Paiute, or the Northern Paiute people, didn't seem to have a real strong attachment to bison or buffalo. But the Western Shoshone and the Northern Shoshone both did, partly because the Snake River Plain around Boise and to the east and west was a big time buffalo hunting area in prehistoric time. Next slide. And as you can see, this is a map of the different divisions of the what they call the Numa. That's the name of the people that all are related, and they're all Shoshone or Paiute or Southern Numic, all these different names of different groups of people. Well, if you see in Oregon, you see where Oregon is, and in the southern half of the east part of the state was occupied what is called the Western Numic, or I'll call the Northern Paiute. And to the east of there, into Idaho and northern Nevada, were the Shoshone. And you see that red star, it's pretty obvious. That red star is pretty much where we think the people came from that occupied the site in Lost Dune. Next slide. Okay, and here's a map of all the sites. And it's kind of ugly because I had to take a 1916 map or 2016 map, and that add a bunch of sites to it. But at any rate, you can see where Burns is on the north part, and you can see all those red stars. Those are all the sites we've identified that, in fact, a couple of them I can't quite see off the bottom of the map, but those are all the sites that we have recorded and identified since 2012, belonging to this constellation of sites that all have similarities. Next slide. This is a picture of a hearth from Lost Dune 1, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but many of these sites are really shallowly buried. This site in particular was buried probably a foot below the surface at the most, as you can see how shallow that hearth is in the excavation. And so when we find these sites, they're generally surface. We can see them on the surface. In fact, 2 years ago, a contractor from Washington was doing a survey for Burns BLM, and they found another site near the Nevada border that has ceramics and has pottery in it. And we've been out there 3 times since and found numerous more arrow points, all desert side notch and Cottonwood triangular. We have found a couple blades. We have found a dentalium shell. Dentalia, the nearest dentalia from here is probably the Washington coast. We've found a bunch more of the different kinds of artifacts that I'm going to show you really soon at that same site. So there's a real strong connection to buffalo at all these sites, and they all have similar artifacts. Next slide. Okay, this is a reconstructed pots from Lost Dune, and they don't look like much, but Bill Lyons and I got together in 1996 and started piecing these 3D puzzles together of sherds we found at the site, and this is what we came up with. The most spectacular pot is the one in the upper right-hand corner. But at any rate, they're all different shapes, different sizes, but they're all very similar to what is known as Shoshone ware. It's a common ware found throughout Idaho, Wyoming, northern Utah, and now in Oregon. Next slide. Here's a shot of the arrow points we found at the site, or at numerous sites. Usually the really exciting things about these sites is we usually find over 20 or anywhere from 20 to 50 arrow points, and they're almost always all either the ones on the right, desert side notch, or the ones on the left, except for one point, the Cottonwood triangular. And these points are beautifully made. The flake scars on them are so narrow that it almost looks like they were using a sharp toothpick to flake them. I know they weren't, but it's amazing how good a technology they are. Most of the arrow points found at sites in Harney County from this period are Rose Springs corner notched. And you never hardly ever see a Rose Springs corner notch at any of these lost dune sites. And another thing I want to mention too is the cottonwood triangulars and desert side notch are almost never found. I mean, we probably find, when we survey 10,000 acres a year on Burns BLM, we're lucky to find 5 of these. Whereas Rose Springs, we see them by the dozens. So at any rate, next slide. Here's some of the tools we found at Lost Dune and elsewhere. But as you can see, except for one artifact in this display, all of them are made out of something besides obsidian. And the reason that is number one, the people that occupied those sites came from a place that was rich in chert and not rich in obsidian. And also because these kinds of tools you're looking at are the kind you use for cutting, scraping, carving, drilling holes in bone, drilling holes in antler, all that kind of thing. And they have to be really tough and really sturdy in order to be usable. And obsidian is not really well suited for any of those tasks because it is brittle. The one thing obsidian has is that it's very, very sharp, sharper than chert. And that's why a lot of times you'll see almost all arrow points made out of obsidian. Next slide. These are those things I was talking about, blades. Blades are probably one of the rarest artifacts you'll see in Oregon. They're long, generally very straight-sided, extremely sharp, good cutting tools, and they're made in a specific way off of what we call a polyhedral core. And I don't know if you guys can see, but I guess my labels are too far south on this slide, but the 2 things on the bottom and the one on the right bottom are polyhedral cores. The 2 on the left are worn out. They're basically very small, and all the blades were taken off when they get off of them. The one on the right is not a completely exhausted core, and it was not found on one of the Lost Dune sites. It was found as an isolate out by a place called Beatty Butte, which is southwest of Burns. But it is an extremely nice example of a polyhedral core. And like I said, polyhedral cores and percussion blades are really uncommon here, and we find them at almost every one of these sites. Next slide. And here's the abraders. This is a kind of blurry picture I took in 1980. But I haven't replaced it yet, obviously. And you see all these little marks in these stones where it looks like they've been abrading something. Well, they are. They're probably sharpening bone tools for flaking, bone tools for sewing or weaving. They're probably sharpening wood. I think we could use those ones on the top. You could use for shaft straighteners for making arrow shafts. But we find this particular kind of sandstone at a number of different sites, and the sandstone is always the same kind, and it's from an area near the Owyhee River, almost into Nevada. So these are very specific to this site type. Next slide. And this is a good picture, kind of composite picture of all the kinds of bone and teeth fragments we find. And those teeth fragments are in the upper left. The one on the far left actually still has some of the enamel on it, so it was a really easy one to date. They didn't actually have to go through a lot of trouble to get the enamel off that because there's still enamel holding part of the tooth together. The other bones in the site, if any archaeologist saw this picture besides me, they would say, they were breaking up bones to get the marrow out first, and then they were taking the remainder chunks and boiling them till all the fat came out of it. This is a very common practice in American Indians. This is how they got their fat, their lard, by boiling broken up bones that appear to have been fire damaged, and then they skim the oil off the top. Very important process used by all Native Americans in North America and probably elsewhere. But at any rate, when we find bones on these sites, they always look like this. They always look very, very broken, fragmented, sometimes fire affected. You can see the ones on the right that are kind of gray colored. Those are all been partially burned. and that's a telltale sign of stone boiling for fat. And these are also common at all of these Shoshone sites, but very, very infrequent elsewhere. Next slide. And this is I think this is the last slide, but I wanted to show you a closer shot of these pottery vessels that we reconstructed from all the sherds found at Lost Dune 1. And I think there are 4 other sites out of the 17 that have pottery on them, which is really unique because there aren't very many places in Oregon you can find pottery. This is one of the few. And from being educated in a school that didn't talk about pottery much, because I was in Portland after all, I got to learn a lot about pottery dealing with this whole site type. And some of these pots were decorated, and it's kind of hard to see this, I admit. There's 3 pot sherds right in the upper middle. You'll see little lines on them, and what they are is where someone would take their fingernail and push it into the soft clay and make a mark. And they do these marks to make a design, geometric usually. So we have some decoration, but mostly we have big cooking pots. And I think that's all I have, although maybe we'll go one more slide to make sure I didn't miss one.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions for Scott about this topic? So
Well, Gretchen, I see Gretchen's question. Should I just go ahead and answer instead of waiting?
Yeah, go ahead.
To know? Okay. Like I said earlier, these sites are usually on the surface and just slightly buried below the surface. The pot sherds at every site we found and other artifacts we found on the surface. And when we have done any excavation, it's usually been, we found everything associated with these sites in less than a foot deep. So these sites are probably a little bit in danger of being eroded away. But like I said, on Burns BLM in the past, we have collected many of the artifacts because they all belong to one really special pack of sites, and we want to keep the record in our museum if we ever had one. But also we want to have those artifacts available for people doing research on the same topic, including me. The one site I'll mention to you right now is one called Lost Dune 2. It was the second site that was found in 2011. And we excavated a spot that was 6 feet long by 6 feet wide and only about a foot deep, and came up with several thousand bone fragments plus artifacts. But we found a place where they were discarding bones that had been stone boiled and tossed them into a pile, and there was just lots and lots and lots of bones there. Almost all buffalo, although we did find evidence of mountain sheep there too.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, does anyone else have a question for Scott about either topic? There was so much information there.
Yeah, and the tough thing talking about archaeology is you have to try to make it understandable, and I hope that I did that, but also not assume that nobody knows anything about it. I mean, it's just kind of a weird combination. So I end up downloading quite a bit of information, and I apologize.
Well, don't apologize. I think it was rich. It was wonderful.
Well, to get the best idea of this type of site, you have to follow all kinds of avenue research. Could you address oops, I missed that.
That's okay. Janice is curious if you could address the existence of lakes, maybe the ancient lakes of the Great Basin.
Well, we do have some Pleistocene lakes in Harney County. In fact, the best one that you could see is one that's just west of Steens Mountain called Catlow Valley. It was part of a much greater lake at the time during the Pleistocene, but there are wave-cut benches like you would see at a rocky shoreline at the ocean, for instance. There are wave-cut benches that are well over 50 feet higher than the highway when you're driving down there, and you can see them very easily. So yeah, we have a lot of evidence in numerous places on the district, in the Alvord Desert, Catlow Valley, even Burns, even around Burns, of former much larger Pleistocene lakes.
Great. And so we also had a question about the people who lived in the area, presumably the Wadadaka band of the Paiute tribe. Did they migrate seasonally, or were they in the area year round?
They migrated within the area year round. They had I think 6,000 square miles is what I think I've read, and I know I've tried to plot it on a map, but their annual round would have taken them within about a 6,000 square mile area. But they would stay in certain places for a length of time. For instance, I talked yesterday about edible plants, and there are root gathering camps in the hills east of Burns that were accessible to salmon fishing in the Malheur River. And I would bet, based on the amount of roots up there and the timing when you can dig them, they would have been in those camps for probably 2 months a year, maybe 3. And then they move on to a different place depending on what was in season in terms of vegetation and where animals were more likely to gather. In fact, we've done surveys on top of Steens Mountain at 9,700 feet and found oodles of sites. And I'm sure it's because every one of those sites is somewhere near a snow melt lake where big game would come to water. So we have sites on the Steens that date back to about the time it was deglaciated, around 9,000 years ago.
Wow. I think this next question from Helen is really a good one and an important one to build context for understanding about federal agencies. So Helen asks, is the BLM the primary agency sponsoring archaeological research in the area? Well,
yes and no. The Forest Service, which is mostly north of Burns, the Malheur National Forest, they have some interesting research going on. Most right now focused on Chinese mining from the late 1800s, between 1860 and 1910. But they're doing some really nice work on the Chinese efforts in mining after the big, gold boom in the 1860s. So they do that. They do Passports in Time, which is a volunteer operation where they can volunteer to go and help excavate or do survey on Forest Service land. And I participated in that when I worked for the Forest Service briefly back in the 90s. But BLM clearly has, Burns BLM has, and Lakeview BLM, those two districts, Lakeview being west of here, they have probably more research going on than anywhere in Oregon. And it's all sponsored by BLM, but also sponsored by universities that are involved. Right now, there's University of Oregon works on Burns District and works on Lakeview District. University of Nevada, Reno works on Lakeview District. We have Texas A&M working up here near Harney Lake, where they we're working on a site that's 12,500 years old. So we have plenty of partners. It's slowed down a little in the last year because of COVID. The universities weren't allowing field schools, but it looks like at least University of Oregon will be working at Rimrock Draw this summer with a field school.
Awesome, thank you for that.
Yeah, and part of the whole research deal, and I'm not going to take credit for this exactly, but I'm a real, I guess I'm very curious, and I put patterns together pretty well in my head. So I've been a real firm, and the woman that took my place is the same way. We really want to see research going on. In fact, that's part of our mission. Even though you sometimes wouldn't know it, at least half of our job is supposed to be associated with public outreach and research on archaeological topics.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it makes it made my job a lot more interesting than what it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I bet. And, does anyone else have any more questions for Scott about either of these topics? I do want to mention that you can get more of Scott annually at the Bird Festival in person when we return to in-person festivals, and online in our Prairie Songs for a Feathered Heart mystery treasure search, which is interactive. Scott has a featured video in that program as well. And I just want to mention all of our partners that make the Bird Festival possible every year are nonprofit organizations, including the Friends of Malheur, Portland Audubon, High Desert Partnership, and our local government agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife Service, local businesses, and community members. So we're really fortunate to have such a enthusiastic and committed group of people engaged in this process of bringing the festival to you every year.
Thank you, Gretchen.
What was that, Scott?
I said thanks to Gretchen. She gave us a thumbs up.
Yes, yes. Thank you, everyone, for participating and joining us this morning. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time and for sharing so much of your knowledge with us.
Thank you for having me.